Bernard McGinn, and I'll do, I'm sure, a very inadequate introduction, given just how wonderful and accomplished Dr. McGinn is. And then I'll turn it over to him to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for questions as we engage with Dr. McGinn on Christian mysticism. So Dr. Bernard McGinn is the Naomi Shenstone Donnelly Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology and of the History of Christianity in the University of Chicago Divinity School. He specializes in the history of Christianity and the history of Christian thought, primarily in the medieval period. Dr. McGinn is widely regarded as the preeminent scholar of mysticism in the Western Christian tradition, and is best known for his comprehensive series on mysticism entitled The Presence of God. And according to Dr. McGinn, even for people who may not have any religious commitment of their own, a study of the great mystics can reveal something about human creativity and genius. So, Dr. McGinn, we're so delighted to have you here with us. I would love for you to assume that we know nothing about mysticism, let alone Christian mysticism. And so the introduction that you're providing today is going to be illuminating, especially also as we enter into the next 2 weeks and learn about Sufism and Kabbalah. So welcome, Dr. McGinn.
Thank you so much, Father Sari, and also thank you for the invitation. And I want to welcome all those good people from your parish here, St. John's Parish, to this morning. And I'm going to try to give a general overview of my notion of Christian mysticism, and then hope to respond to any questions you might have. Just to frame what I'm going to say, I'll put it under the heading of 3 different questions. The first is, why is mysticism important? The second one goes a little further. Why is mysticism necessary? And then I'm going to talk about what is mysticism, which is hard to do in a short time, but I will try. Now, mysticism is a word that's very often misunderstood. May even be frightening or off-putting to some people, because for many, mysticism means something. What does it call up in your mind? I ask you. Many people, it calls up something bizarre, something uncanny, something weird, something magical. For other people, it said, oh, mysticism is the realm of paranormal, strange religious experiences, visions of God, stigmata, the wounds of Christ appearing on the body, even things like levitation, the body being able to rise, or in very severe forms of asceticism and the like. So it's all the strange stuff related to religion. And I don't think that's correct, although it's still a view shared by many. Even those who recognize that many of the saints and holy people of the tradition can be described as mystics or contemplatives, I use the words interchangeably, they often see mysticism as an elite phenomenon, something meant for the very privileged few, and something that really doesn't have anything to do with ordinary Christian living. Now, the point of my talk this morning is to try to say that that's a really incorrect view of mysticism, and that, on the contrary, mysticism, or the mystical element, as I like to call it, or contemplation, the contemplative life, is something that's integral and even necessary to all Christian living. And many of the great religious thinkers of the 20th century have recognized that. I start with a couple of quotations. There are many of them. Henri Bremond was a French priest who was a great scholar of French mysticism. And in his long 11-volume history, literary history of religious thought in France, he says, it is not possible to ignore the mystics without disowning the self. It's not possible to ignore the mystics without disowning the self. Karl Rahner, great German theologian who died in 1984, also believed that mysticism was absolutely integral to Christianity. In a number of his essays, he talks about the nature of mysticism and says, and I again quote here, the Christian of the future will either be a mystic or will not be a Christian at all. Another great French mystic, the French priest scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, writing to a priest friend of his, this is in the middle of 1920s, has this phrase where he says, "Mysticism remains the great science and the great art, the only power capable of synthesizing the riches accumulated by the other forms of human activity." So for Teilhard, scientist and philosopher, mysticism, in a sense, was the central kind of science and art. Now, I could take a number of other quotations, not just necessarily from religious thinkers, but from poets, from musicians, even from scientists, who would also talk about the absolute necessity of, or the importance of mysticism, at least. So my point is, I want to go even further and say mysticism, in a certain sense, is necessary, certainly to believers, those trying to fulfill a faithful Christian vocation. Because mysticism, in essence, is not something bizarre, extraordinary. Mysticism is a deeper sense of God's transforming presence in our lives. And that deeper sense of God's transforming presence in life is part of the vocation given to all Christians in baptism. The grace of baptism is the call to begin leading a mystical life. That is a life where you're seeking God and you're trying to seek a deeper sense of God's presence in your life. People will come at that and realize it in different kinds of levels, because, of course, ultimately it's divine grace that gives you the level that you're going to attain. So mysticism, in a certain sense, lives on a continuum of experience or consciousness. The people we call mystics, the great figures in the history of Christianity, think of Teresa of Avila, or John of the Cross, or Meister Eckhart, or Bernard of Clairvaux, could name many, many of these. These are the experts, the great mystics who stand out. But all Christians who are faithfully trying to live a life that based on their baptismal grace are called to mystical consciousness and called to go as deep as they can with the grace of God in the realization of that transformative presence. So that's why I say that mysticism is more than just something that's understandably useful, that mysticism for the believer is something that's absolutely essential. Now, it's also important, I think, to understand that what I call the mystical element, and I've been using that term, the mystical element is not the whole of Christianity. It's an integral part of Christian living. Great English Catholic philosopher from the beginning of the last century, Baron Friedrich von Hugel, wrote a 2-volume work, The Mystical Element of Religion. And von Hugel insisted there that mysticism exists along with what he called the institutional element and the intellectual element as one of the 3 basic components of Christian living and the whole Christian religion. So that mysticism doesn't exist apart from religion. It's not the essence or core of religion. It's one of the 3 integral parts. It exists along with institution, it exists along with intellectual appropriation. And von Hugel figured those 3 elements, or illustrated those 3 elements in Christianity by talking about the 3 apostles. Peter representing the institutional element, Paul representing the intellectual element, and the writer of the spiritual gospel, John, representing the mystical element. And von Hugel insists that healthy Christian religion has to integrate those 3 aspects: the institutional, the intellectual, and the mystical. If one or the other is missing, or if one or the other tries to dominate the others, say the institutional tries to dominate the intellectual and the mystical, von Hugel argued that religion is going off the tracks and grave consequences will follow. The third point about the necessity of mysticism is that living a mystical or contemplative life, it's not just a matter of performing certain kinds of acts, prayer, or certain forms of asceticism, or many others. These things are necessary, but they're not, in a certain sense, completion of the whole of the mystical element itself. That mysticism, or the mystical element, is a transformative lifestyle that affects everything that we do. Thomas Merton, who many of you may have read in his great book, New Seeds of Contemplation, from the 1960s, puts it this way, I quote, "Contemplation," which is, he uses mysticism and contemplation interchangeably, which is quite right. "Contemplation is more than a consideration of abstract truths about God. It's more even than effective meditation on the things we believe. It is an awakening, an enlightenment, and the amazing intuitive grasp by which love gains certitude of God's creative and dynamic intervention in daily life." So the contemplative life, Merton argues in that wonderful book, which I recommend very strongly, is more than just a Sunday afternoon or morning exercise. It's something that affects the whole way in which we live. Fourthly, mysticism is certainly personal. It happens to the individual in terms of the individual's life, prayer life, etc. But mysticism is not individualistic or selfish. The idea of the mystic as, somebody who goes off out into the desert and gets lost, or goes up to the high mountain and is never seen. That's not the real history of mysticism, although many went off into the desert, but then they became also active in the Christian church. That when we find God in contemplation, we find God not just for ourselves, our own enjoyment, but for others. And the mystics insist that the love of God and the love of neighbor is the goal of the mystical journey. And if you go through the history, study the lives and effect of the great mystics, you will see that however much they had a very personal relationship and of a special kind with God, they also are very effective in what we might call the apostolic dimension, or the active dimension of Christian living. They were great Episcopal leaders like Augustine. They were great preachers like Meister Eckhart. And even someone like Teresa of Avila, who's thought of as, kind of ideal contemplative. What did she do? She led the reform of the Carmelite order in Spain. She founded 16 different Carmelite houses, traveling all over Spain to spread the reform, etc. She was supremely active. At the same time, she was a great contemplative. So that the mystical element in Christianity is always a part of the life of the church. It's meant to take place within the ecclesial community and through the activities of the ecclesial community, worship, sacraments, etc., etc. You could describe it as the deeper level of one's ecclesiological existence. And finally, living the mystical contemplative life where we find God is also where we find our true selves. And this is why most of the great mystics of both the past and even distant past, but even the past century, Merton is a good example, would say, Merton's writings frequently argue that the only way to arrive at the true self and overcome the false self, which so often we can, kind of fall into through our modern society, is through a contemplative life. And that true self is not so much a matter of, psychology or psychoanalysis, important as these things are. The true self that Merton says we can find, and that other mystics also say is the goal, is the self as seen by God. It's the self as created as the image and likeness of God. Genesis 1:26, one of the really key texts in the history of Christian mysticism. So as a result of this, just these kind of few headings that I've tried to mention here, many modern theologians and mystics have used the phrase everyday mysticism. Everyday mysticism. In order to overcome that notion that mysticism is something special, set apart from the rest of us, an odd kind of way of life that no one we know has ever really experienced. Mysticism is meant to be everyday, which is number one, it's meant to be for all people, not just a few, and not just the clergy, but for all the baptized. And secondly, it's meant for all. It can also be found everywhere. Mystical contemplation and attitude towards God that is a mystical attitude is not something that you say for church on Sunday mornings, or it's not something you do only when you retire, if you pray to a very special place, et cetera, something that happens everywhere. Meister Eckhart, who I mentioned, the great 13th century, 14th century Dominican preacher and mystic, says, if you think you're finding more of God in church than you are in the stable, it's like wrapping God's head up in a towel and sticking him under a bench. Getting what the real God is. You find God everywhere. Find God in church. You also find God in the stable. You find God in your workshop. You find God in your study, if you're more of an academic. You find God everywhere. And you say, well, that sounds kind of strange, but that's actually been the common teaching of the great mystics. And in longer forms of these talks, I cite many mystics, Gregory the Great, the Pope around the year 600, Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century. And let me just cite two texts that emphasize that message. The first one is from Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian of the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas doesn't write about very much about mysticism or himself, but mysticism is a very important part of his dogmatic teaching. So both in his Summa and his early summary of dogmatic theology, the writing on the sentences of Peter Lombard, he takes up the question of mystical contemplation, and he compares the active life, the apostolic life we would call it, along with the mystical life. And then he's responding, the scholastic theology is a response to pro and con on different kinds of points. He's responding to a point of some who say that, well, active people in the active life should not try to live a contemplative life. They shouldn't be interested in contemplation. Here's what he says. This is in his commentary on Peter Lombard. He says, to the fifth point, we say that not everyone in the active life will come to the perfect state of contemplation. Nevertheless, every Christian who is in a state of salvation must participate in some way in contemplation, since the precept that it says in the Psalms is true for all. Be still and see that I am the Lord. So all Christians, Thomas Aquinas says, who are in the state of salvation must also participate in contemplation, although they may not arrive at its height. The second quotation is from the recent Catechism of the Catholic Church, issued by Pope John Paul II in 1994. And one of the paragraphs there, it's 2014, I think puts it very, very clearly when it expresses it in this way. Let me read this passage. Catechism says, spiritual progress tends toward ever more intimate union with Christ. This union is called mystical because it participates in the mystery of Christ through the sacraments, the holy mysteries, and in and through Christ in the mystery of the Holy Trinity. God calls us to this intimate union with him, even if the special graces or extraordinary signs of this mystical life are granted only to some for the sake of manifesting the gratuitous gift given to all. It's a very succinct and I think wonderful passage. That is, we're all called to union with Christ, and this is mystical union because it's connected with the mystery of Christ and the mystery of the Holy Trinity. And God calls us all to this intimate union, even if the special graces, extraordinary signs of the mystical life, those are the things like visions and the stigmata and other kinds of things. Those special graces are granted only to some. And they're not granted just for their pleasure. They're granted for the sake of manifesting the gratuitous grace given to all. The gratuitous grace is what in Catholic tradition we call sanctifying grace. It's the grace that saves you. And that's the essential or fundamental grace. So finally, because I know our time is somewhat limited, I want to turn to my third question, well, what is mysticism then? Well, let's start etymologically, the history of a word. Mysticism is a modern word. It's first created in the 17th century, probably first in France by around 1640s or 50s, la mystique. And right from the beginning, it was understood sometimes used positively and sometimes used negatively. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary under mysticism, you'll find it's the first entry in the Oxford English Dictionary from the 18th century, 1726, if I remember, is very negative. But the Oxford English Dictionary didn't get all the early uses, because if you read the Quaker mystics of 17th century England, they were already using mysticism in a very positive sense for their sense of the inner life. So mysticism is a modern word, and some people have said, well, we really shouldn't use it then. The ancient term was much more the term contemplation. And the mystics in the Middle Ages were ordinarily called contemplatives, contemplativi. But the answer to that is that the qualifier, the adjective or adverb mystical, mystikos, mystikus, is actually very ancient in Christianity. It goes back not to the New Testament itself, but to the middle of the 2nd century. Christians begin to take over that term mystical in order to understand key aspects of Christian living. And mystical, the Greek term, really means just secret or hidden, coming from a Greek verb, a very ancient verb about closing the mouth. So it's what happens when you close the mouth and are silent. And Christians seized on this word to indicate what I call the depth dimensions of the Christian living and Christian reality. What are the depth dimensions? Fundamentally, Scripture, because the overwhelming the overwhelming use of mystical is to indicate the deep meaning of Scripture. Scripture has a surface meaning, what the ancients call the literal sense, the letter, what happened. But Scripture also has a deep meaning. What does it mean for us? Sometimes called a spiritual meaning, sometimes called the allegorical meaning, but most often called the mystical meaning. It's the hidden level of Scripture. It's what the non-believers aren't going to grasp, but the believers will understand. It's Christ speaking to us in the Scriptures. And that was the overwhelmingly most important use for the term mystical, right down to the 12th and 13th century. But Christians also began to talk about mystical rituals and rites, baptism, the Eucharist. These are mystical rites or rituals. Why are they mystical? Because they have a surface appearance and they have a deeper meaning. A pagan in the 2nd century seeing Christians baptizing, what would he see? No, they're pouring water over somebody's head. Or when such a person would see the Eucharist, he'd see people gathered around a table sharing bread and wine. That's the surface. But what's the mystical meaning of baptism? What's the mystical meaning of the Eucharist? It's Christ, becoming one with Christ in baptism, sharing in Christ through the Eucharist. That's what makes these mystical rituals. The same way Christians talked about mystical contemplation. Ancient philosophers talked about contemplation, but that was often contemplation of very important philosophical truths. The Christians' mystical contemplation is a gazing towards God and God alone as revealed in the Scriptures. Christians then began to talk about mystical union. We find that as early as the 4th century, somehow coming into a deep hidden union with God that wouldn't be obvious on the outside. And then they began talking about mystical theology. It was early about the year 500. Mystical theology is not something you do in the classroom. Mystical theology is what you do in life. And if you read the mystical theology treatise of the mysterious Dionysius, sometime around the year 500 CE or so, what you'll see is it's kind of a manual for a monastic community and the life of a monastic community. What they were supposed to be living was mystical theology. They weren't doing it in class. They were doing it through their prayer. in their liturgy, etc., etc. So if mysticism is a pretty new word, the mystical dimension of Christianity is almost as old as Christianity itself, and it's associated with many other key terms, some of which are biblical, New Testament, some of which were taken over from the Greek world in which in which Christianity was incarnated. The term mystery itself, mysterion. Well, the mystical life is a life living the mystery. And that, of course, is a term we find both in the Gospels, Mark and Luke, very frequently in Paul's epistles, the great mystery of the kingdom of God. And then the whole term that I've already mentioned, theoria or contemplatio, gazing or seeing at God. That's not in the New Testament, but Christians often said that's the inner meaning of Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. For Christians, that's what theoria, contemplatio was. Another term associated with this is a term in Greek, theosis, in Latin, deificatio, in English, divinization or deification. You don't find it in the Bible as such in the New Testament, but there are many texts in the Psalms and John and in epistles of Peter, et cetera, that talk about God becoming man so that man might become God. And you might say that's kind of the center of our understanding of the incarnation, and that's deification. So Christians said that even though the term deification doesn't really exist, this is what's being described throughout the whole of the Old, well, especially the New Testament, but also the Old Testament as read through mystical interpretation. So how then might we try to define mysticism? What's the meaning of mysticism? Well, the experts don't agree. Mm-hmm. In 1899, Anglican canon W.R. Ing, in his book Christian Mysticism, put it this way: no word in our language, not even socialism, has been employed more loosely than mysticism. And Louis Dupré, in the article on mysticism in the 1987 Encyclopedia of Religion, echoes this. He says, no definition could be both meaningful and sufficiently comprehensive to include all experiences that at some point or another have been described as mystical. And if you look at books on mysticism and studies of mysticism, you'll find there are a plethora of various definitions and understandings. So what is my general take on this? Well, I've given throughout the course of my writings what I call a kind of working model or a heuristic model for the word mysticism. And let me read this to you, and then I'll unpack it a little bit to try to make it more understandable. So I've said in my long history and also in Theology I did on essential writings of Christian mysticism, I put it this way. Mysticism is that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effects of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. So mysticism is that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. Now, let me just, in the time that remains here, let me just take out 7 terms here in that definition or work. I mean, I don't say it's a hard and fast definition. It's a kind of working description. But let me take these out to try to exemplify a little more clearly what I mean. First of all, mysticism is a part or element of religion, a point I've already made, and I think von Hugel is a wonderful model here. Mysticism is not the whole of religion. It's a part or element. But secondly, mysticism is a process. It's a life journey. It involves preparation. It involves a kind of attainment. It involves the effects of that attainment on your life. Mysticism, when studied by philosophers, often concentrates on the moment of mystical consciousness, the moment of union with God. And philosophers spend a lot of time, to kind of parse out mystical, the accounts of the mystics on that way. But that loses sight of the fact that mysticism is really a life journey. It's a process. It's not just a moment in or out of time. You have to understand how the mystic prepares for a contemplative experience, what that contemplative experience of consciousness of, and what effect it has on the life of the mystic. Thirdly, note I've used the term consciousness. It's a preparation for the consciousness of a direct and transformative presence of God in one's life. So why don't I just speak about experience? And most scholars do talk a lot about mystical experience. But I use the term consciousness because experience for many people connotes feeling, sensation, emotion, and mysticism is more than just a new feeling. It's a total awareness, which is what consciousness is. Consciousness is the awareness that exists on all levels of human activity: sensing, thinking, loving, deciding. It's a holistic term. And so for the mystic, it's the mystic's consciousness, both in terms of feeling, if you will, and emotion, but also in terms of thinking and deciding, in terms of loving, etc., that is transformed. And therefore, I find the term consciousness more inadequate. It's a larger term, if you will, than just the term experience, at least in most of us. And what the mystics are arguing here is something that we will find a little, perhaps unusual, but ordinary consciousness, we experience something, we are aware of something, and we're also aware of our own awareness, particularly if we reflect on that. The mystic insists that in mystical consciousness, there are three levels. There's the level of awareness of the objects we're directed to. There's awareness of the self, and there's some kind of co-awareness of God. Merton used the term meta-consciousness. Now, that meta-consciousness of co-awareness is often implicit. We don't recognize it. But the mystics, it gradually becomes more and more explicit and sometimes more clear. Fourthly, the mystics insist that this consciousness is in some way direct or immediate. Well, can God ever be immediately perceived in this life? Complicated philosophical and theological kinds of questions. But the mystics insist there's a difference between our ordinary sense of God and the mystical direct or more immediate sense of God. And they do speak of immediacy very often. They will always distinguish between whatever experience of God we may have in this life, however more and more direct it is, and the final experience of God, the final consciousness of God, which of course is the heavenly consciousness. The mystics also insist, and this is the fifth point, that such consciousness is transformative. It changes the person. It enables that person to be transformed and perhaps to help transform others as well. And this transformation is a matter of both loving, but also knowing. It's a matter of deeper experience and consciousness of the fact that we are loved by God in an infinite way. And it's also a new way of knowing God. Not that we know more stuff about God, but that we have a sense of knowing God now in a more personal way. If you will, it's kind of connatural. And it involves both a positive sense that God is in some way connatural, close to us, and also a deeper sense of what we might call the negative knowing of God, which is the recognition that God cannot be understood. Theologians and most believers say, oh, God cannot really be understood. The mystics know that in a new way, just because they've had a much more direct consciousness. And then the two last points, you'll notice that I've used the term presence of God. Many scholars of mysticism have talked about mystical union as the defining characteristic. And the mystics themselves often talk about mystical union. And that's one of the fundamental ways in which presence comes to speech. But mystics also use other language about this new consciousness of God. They talk about the vision of God. They talk about the contemplation of God. They talk about tasting God, touching God, radical obedience to God, etc. These are all a variety of linguistic terms that mystics use to try to describe in the long run what is undescribable. And I would say they're much more, they all can be put under the umbrella of presence. And mystical union is one of the fundamental ways in which this new presence is described, but it's not the only way. And there are some mystics who avoid the term mystical union. Augustine of Hippo is a good example. Augustine doesn't talk about mystical union, I think because he knew that the pagan philosopher, the Neoplatonic philosophers, talked about union with the one, and he felt that was different from what he experienced. If you read his great account in his Confessions about he and his mother Monica, they attain God through an ascent and they touch God, but he doesn't talk about them uniting with God. So presence, I argue, is a more capacious, a more flexible, a more adaptable term to convey all of the categories. And we must understand, of course, God is never an object that becomes present to us. God is not an object at all. God's presence is more like the presence of one person to another, even though that's a kind of analogical description. Finally, I just want to emphasize one more point. It doesn't come out quite as strongly in my description, but mysticism, or at least the study of mysticism, always brings us back to language. Language. The practice of mysticism may be in silence or with speech. It can be in the speech of prayer, can be in the silence of prayer. But when we try to understand mysticism and understand the message of the great mystics of the past, we are immersed once again in language, the mystical text and its language. So the study of mysticism as a phenomenon, this is very, very important, I think, for our own mystical lives, is a study of how the mystics have talked about God, the impossible task, the verbal strategies that they have to use, and the way in which you always talk about God both in positive fashion and in negative fashion. The mystics use this term positive or cataphatic, and negative or apophatic. Just means saying God is good, but then unsaying God is not really good in the way in which we understand goodness. So mystics always combine the positive and the negative, and then they often say God goes beyond all languages, both positive language and negative language, both the cataphatic and the apophatic, into what I like to call the hyperphatic, language that's beyond language. So one of the things I think that makes mysticism very interesting, and I'm going to stop there, is that when we read mystical texts, we're engaged in a wonderful process that's more like reading poetry than it is like reading a piece of straightforward prose, because the mystics have to write about God in an indirect fashion, always realizing that they're engaged in an impossible but necessary task, talking about the God who cannot really be comprehended or even talked about. So I think that's...
Dr. McGinn, thank you. That was just really wonderful, so informative. And I feel like even myself, I have like 7 different questions. I'm gonna hold off on asking my own to get some participation from our attendees. So just a quick note, if you are in the parish hall, you'll notice there's a microphone set up on the right, and I ask that if you have a question, you simply walk up there. I'll see you walk up and I'll invite you to speak. And then if you are participating from home, you have the option of either writing a question in the chat box. We already have one. And then also you can raise your electronic hand. It makes a big difference for me if you actually go to the reactions button and raise the electronic hand as opposed to waving to the screen, because I don't see everybody on my screen right now. And that will prioritize you, and I'll see you at that point. So if you are wanting to raise your hand, click on reactions, raise hand, and then I'll see you at that point. So let me begin with this question from the chat box. Cindy says, is all of Gnosticism mystical? The Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of John, ? You mentioned the letters of John. Could you elaborate, please?
Okay, the Gospel of John is traditionally the great spiritual gospel, or we might say mystical gospel, and I believe that's certainly true. And the Johannine letters fit there too. The Gnostics of the 2nd and 3rd century, many of whom thought of themselves certainly as Christians, also wrote mystical texts. And a number of the texts that come to us from the Gnostics, so for instance, the Gospel of Truth, many people may have read that, I think can be described as mystical texts. There's a big argument in the Christian church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries over whether the Gnostic interpretation of Jesus is the correct interpretation. And eventually, the Gnostic interpretation is kind of excluded by what comes to be called the Orthodox or the mainline Christian tradition. That's a long story. But I think certain aspects of what we call Gnosticism and certain of the Gnostic writings are definitely mystical texts.
Thank you. We have a question by David in the parish hall. David, just walk right up to there and thank you.
Good morning. Very stimulating discussion. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. So when you first posed the question, like what is mysticism at the beginning of your talk, I was thinking, okay, what do I think it is? And what I came up with off the cuff is that, okay, very simply, it's dealing with the fact that we're in Plato's cave, and either trying to escape it or trying to at least adjust our awareness of reality so that we know that we are sitting in the darkness and looking at shadows flickering on a wall. I mean, I guess if Plato were alive today, he would have said, there's reality as it exists, and there's experience as our brain kind of constructs and interprets it, and those aren't the same thing. So I don't know. By the end of your talk, I kind of thought, okay, that's maybe the gist of it. I mean, you said at the end that St. Augustine was distinguishing between what he experienced, which was, you said, being in the presence of God, as distinct from what the Neoplatonists of his time talked about, which was union with God. Okay, I mean, if you're a lumper and not a splitter, to me that sounds pretty close. I don't know. So my question is that a valid or helpful framework for looking at it in your view? And I have another question, but maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thanks. I'll be happy to try to answer that, and it does raise the question. Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy helped Christian mystics to express much of their own understanding of their consciousness of God. And Plato and Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, was certainly great mystics. So the Christians were able to take over the language of Platonic theoria, Platonic contemplation, and also many of the categories from Neoplatonism, and they helped them express what it is they wanted to express. Augustine would be a very, very good example here of the fact that they took so much over, but then they also recognized there were limits. In the Confessions, for example, Augustine says how the books of the Platonists really influenced him very much. And there he read that the word was with God. That's how he interpreted them. But then he said he did not read in the books of the Platonists that the word had become flesh. So in other words, the Platonists helped the early Christian mystics, and indeed the medieval mystics as well, to be able to express what they were trying to teach. But they also recognized there were essential differences between what you might call Platonic philosophical mysticism and Christian mysticism. And fundamental here was the fact that the word became flesh, the incarnation.
Thank you, Dr. McGinn. Let me see back to Zoom. Any questions? Just raise your hand so I can get a sense of that. Okay. Naeem Atik, I'm asking you to unmute yourself. So just click on that request and you'll be able to do that. Just give him a second. Let me do that again. I'm hitting, just hit accept. Where I said ask to unmute. So let's say the host is asking you to unmute. Okay, 1 second. I'm not seeing that. Let me actually enable participants to unmute themselves and see if that helps.
I did.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you. Thank you so much for your words. I just wonder, was there a relationship, or is there a relationship between mysticism and justice? That were the mystics aware of the importance of becoming involved with people who were oppressed, with the whole question of justice for the underdogs and so on? And if that's the case, do we have any examples, special examples that one can refer to? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very, very important question, because once again, and many people think of the mystics as kind of dropouts to society. They have no interest in social questions, issues of social justice alike. And, this may be true of some mystics, but it's really not true of the mainline mystical tradition, that the mystics, even of the early period and the medieval period, always insisted that there were certain obligations in terms of justice and obligations towards others that even superseded contemplation. Bernard of Clairvaux, talks about, contemplation of God is much more delightful than apostolic action. But if you're in the middle of a contemplative act and you're called to do an act of justice, if you're called to do an act of Christian love to the neighbor, you have to leave your contemplation. Now, framing it in terms of social justice issues, I think becomes clearer in the modern period. I've just finished a book called Modern Mystics: An Introduction, where I take 10 figures from the last century, 20th century. And many of those people were very deeply involved in social justice questions, and found that their involvement in questions of social justice came out of their contemplative experience. I think that's clearer in a sense in the 20th century, perhaps, but I think you find the roots of it also in many of the earlier mystics as well. So if you look at people, I mentioned the name of Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton in the 1960s, one of the great spokesmen, the people for justice, against war, against social inequality, against racism, etc. And for Merton, that was all a part very much of his devotion to the contemplative life. But he was in a certain sense better known for his social justice activities, and he was more controversial for his social justice activities in the 1960s, speaking out against the Vietnam War, favoring racial equality in the United States, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Let me keep going back and forth, see if anyone in the parish hall would like to ask a question. I don't see anybody standing up at the microphone, but if there is a question. Okay, there we go. Go ahead.
I'm Dylan, and I wanted to know if you could compare the Christian mysticism to other faiths mysticism, like maybe the Sufis or someone. I know that a lot of the union with God and some other traditions are doing something physically to take you out of sort of this physical world, like the Sufis spin, or even the Hindus practice yoga to try to get, in the Hindu tradition, the monkey in your mind, like quiet, so that you can have that union with God. I just wanted to hear what you thought about the different traditions in other religions compared to Christianity and mysticism.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's very important today for those who are interested in mysticism to have some knowledge not only of their own tradition, but also of other traditions, insofar as they can. In the ecumenical world in which we live, we no longer can live in independent little cubby holes, but we need to reach out to people in other traditions. And for myself, my own work in Jewish mysticism, and to a lesser extent in Sufi mysticism, has been tremendously illuminating for the way in which I understand Christian mysticism. It enables me to see things about Christian mysticism that I never would have seen unless I had been studying and dialoguing with mystical teachers of other traditions. As I said, particularly Judaism. I've visited Israel fairly often and taught at Hebrew University with scholars of Kabbalah, and I've talked a good deal with scholars of Sufism and the like. So it's complicated, but I think today our historical situation demands that we have not only an openness to these other mystical traditions, but that we also should make the effort to dialogue with them, to try to learn from them, and also to study them insofar as we can. Now, it's much more complicated. There are certainly practices in Christianity that are meant to induce particular kinds of prayer states or ecstatic states or moments of consciousness. They're not quite the same as things like the Sufi practices or the Kabbalistic practices or the Hindu practices, but that's a very complicated question that could not be answered in a couple of minutes.
Thank you. Let me invite Genevra Everdale.
Yes. I think you said something that there's no direct mention in the Bible towards mysticism. But my question is, when Jesus walks on water, when he calms the storm, when he says, if you have faith, you can move the mountain, isn't that him leading us to mysticism? Isn't that having him telling us to lean into God and know that he is there?
Oh, I fully agree. I mean, I think the New Testament is very, very much a mystical text, and that is the way in which it was interpreted, almost from the beginning. And what I was trying to point out was that the kind of technical language of mysticism itself is often taken over from the Greek world in which early Christianity came to life. So you don't find the actual word mystikos in the New Testament. You don't actually find the word contemplation or theoria. But what you find in the New Testament, both in the life of Jesus as the exemplar and in the writings of those who are his followers, both the gospel writers and Paul and the other apostolic writers, is you find a deep mystical teaching based on the person of Jesus as God's revelation, inviting us to this deeper consciousness of God. And that's the whole, particularly the significance of the Gospel of John, but it's also present in the Synoptics and very deeply in Paul. Paul is a very great mystic, and all you have to do is read his famous, many, many texts. His vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, his text in 2 Corinthians about being raised up to the third heaven. These are kind of exemplary foundation texts for later Christian mystics.
Dr. McGinn, when you first started, you talked about how there are some words like mysticism where there's all kinds of associations that might be incorrect. And that there are, in fact, it sounds like there are many of us who might actually be mystics, except we've never used that particular terminology, right? Because of maybe we practice certain things that would qualify as mystic practices or whatever. But so I have a kind of a two-part question. One is this word mysticism prominent in certain Christian traditions over others? Whereas, other Christian traditions would use a different language to describe the same type thing. So that's kind of my first one. And the other one is it possible that sometimes in trying to grasp a phenomenon like experiencing this mystical connection with Christ, that when we try to grasp it with language and with definitions and academically, that we in fact find that we're moving further away from the simplicity of this thing?
Well, to answer your second question first, I think that's certainly quite possible. We cannot academicize or intellectualize mysticism. We can study it, but we have to be very careful because it's more than academia. That's why I made that point. Mystical theology doesn't mean something you do in the classroom. It never has meant anything that's done in the classroom. But when we study phenomena in the modern world, we do have to, use our minds. We have to try to appropriate them intellectually, recognizing that they're not meant just for intellectual exercise, but for actual practice. And that, I think, is part of the study of mysticism today. You're quite right also to say the terms like mysticism and spirituality were not often used particularly by some Protestant denominations. They were much more at home in Roman Catholicism and in Eastern Orthodoxy to some extent. But, that's changed during my own lifetime. The term spirituality 50 or 60 years ago, I think most Protestants would have kind of shied away from the term spirituality. Today, that's not the case. So all the Protestant denominations, from evangelical denominations through the more establishment denominations, if you will, make use of the term spirituality all over the place, and often also make use of the term mysticism. So there's been a spread outward from traditional Catholic usages, where those terms were long enshrined and embedded, into, I think, the wider Christian ecumenical discussion.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. I see someone, David, it looks like you're standing at the microphone again. So come on up, and then I'll take 1 more question from our Zoom audience, and we'll conclude our session today.
Okay, thank you. Back for more. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what you called everyday mysticism, or mysticism for the people. You mentioned that these experiences of ecstasy or visions or joy or grace, or the direct presence of God is something that is available to contemplatives and saints, holy fools and the like, but not necessarily for the rest of us. Are those experiences necessary to participate in this mystical element of Christianity? If it's necessary, how does the man in the street go about experiencing those things? And if it's not necessary, then what does mysticism for the people look like? How do we do mysticism if we decide we want to do it right now? Or I don't know, are we doing it already? How do we tell?
I think many people are doing it already, but not naming it. And the term everyday mysticism means that everybody who is trying to live a sincere Christian life, trying to live a life of prayer to God, trying to find God's deeper presence in their lives, is already on the mystical path, which is a continuum, I think, as I mentioned before. That is, it has different kinds of levels. And we're all not going to reach the level of somebody who goes into an ecstatic state, let alone somebody who has visions like a Teresa of Avila. But we may reach a sense that, God is really active and present here. And particularly when I try to direct my attention to God and the effects that God's presence may have in my life. That's what I mean about the continuum, and about it existing on different levels, from beginning levels through more serious and more direct kinds of levels. And why not only myself, but many great teachers of the past century have used that phrase, everyday mysticism, because it says it can happen to you anywhere. It can happen to anyone who is sincerely trying to live a deeper Christian life. And my sense is that if anyone who's trying to do that is on the mystical path. We don't know exactly where they are. They don't know, because it's partly due also to divine action. And I feel that that's what we're called to by the grace of baptism. I don't know whether that's helpful or not. So if one is sincerely trying to find God, if one is trying to live a Christian life, if one is engaged in a real prayer life, that's the mystical path. That's the everyday mysticism.
Okay, thanks.
Wonderful. Well, friends, sadly, we're actually out of time, and I didn't estimate correctly when I said I had time for 2 more questions. So we're going to have to conclude here. And I do want to say, Dr. McGinn, how honored we are and grateful to you for taking the time to introduce us to Christian mysticism. This was a wonderful first step for us. And also to let everybody know, including yourself, Dr. McGinn, if you're interested to wake up early next Sunday as well, we have an introduction to Mysticism and Islam. This is next Sunday. And it's going to be presented by Dr. Mais Al-Qaisi, Assistant Professor of Arabic Heritage and Islamic Studies at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. She's also going to be joining us via Zoom. Everyone, please just join me in offering your gratitude to Dr. McGinn today and thanking him for joining us. So
thank you very much, Father Sari, and thank you all for attending and for your questions. I appreciate them very much.
Well, blessings to you and blessings to everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you, Dr. McGinn. Bye-bye.